Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the podcast Little Eyes, Little Ears, Centering Children and Youth in Gender-Based Violence Work. This podcast is from the Learning Network at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. The purpose of this podcast is to enhance work to support children and youth in contexts of intimate partner violence. I'm Dr. Linda Baker, and I'm pleased to host today's episode with our guest, Tatiana Ferguson. Tatiana Ferguson is the co-founder of the Black Queer Youth Collective and a leader in equity and inclusion. Since immigrating to Canada from the Bahamas, Tatiana has been honored for her contributions to queer and trans activism, and she is actively involved in several projects and initiatives promoting the health and well-being of 2S LGBTQ+ individuals in Canada. Tatiana, thank you so much for being here with us today to discuss supporting gender and sexually diverse children and youth. I wonder if you would start by just sharing a little bit about yourself with our audience.
Yeah, hi. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. So for some of you who may be familiar with my work and those who are just being introduced to my work, I'm Tatiana Ferguson. I'm an equity and inclusion specialist. I co-founded the Black Queer Youth Collective back in 2017 in response to a need that emerged in youth programs around creating programs that were culturally responsive to Black, queer, and trans youth. This work has since went on to inform multiple public policies. I've worked with all three levels of government, including on the Toronto for All action plan and the Toronto for All public education campaign around trans youth. There's a lot of discussions and discourse that I have, thoughts and perspectives on supporting Black LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ youth more broadly in the GBV sector.
Well, that's exactly what we want to hear, your perspectives today. So again, welcome. I wondered if you would start us off by talking about some of the specific types of violence that gender and sexually diverse children and youth might face.
Yeah, so I think over the years, there's a variety of violence. I think the most common would be homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. But that plays out in a variety of ways. We see bullying happening in school. There's sexual assault and harassment of queer and trans women. There's fetishism and objectification. And then there are the social and systemic issues that impact this demographic. So discrimination in relation to employment and challenges with accessing education and skills development. So there's, I think, a variety of issues that impact the queer and trans community. I even think that the language has evolved so much where organizations are, I think, adapting to a newer demographic that has emerged, which are non-binary youth, youth who are rejecting the notions of gender binaries and are kind of identifying in ways that's most authentic to themselves. But that have kind of created more issues because our system is very gendered. There are women washrooms and men washrooms. There are designated sporting activities for women and men, and we see a lot of this play out in sports. I'm not sure if this demographic watch sports, but we know that trans inclusion in athletics have been a big debate, a heated debate. And a lot of the violence that young children and youth experience is really based on their lack of ability to fit into these gendered categories. I would say those are some of the main issues that come to mind when I think about challenges that affect LGBTQ youth.
And as I listen to you talk about some of those issues and forms of violence, I can't help but think about what's happening in so many jurisdictions right now, where school boards and personnel are advocating that some of the programs and options that youth may have had, such as expressing a name they want to be known by or a pronoun they want to be known by, that schools are saying no, that's maybe not okay without a parent's consent. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to informed consent, as well as I think the protection of children and youth, it's twofold. There are legal obligations for parents and guardians, but a lot of the children and youth also desire to have agency, desire to have autonomy and a voice for themselves. So when I think about how parents can dismiss queer and trans identities because it does not fit their personal preference, it I think creates a hostile environment for those young people. It creates an environment where they don't feel seen, where they don't feel heard. And of course, we understand this affects their mental health. This affects their well-being, their ability to socially connect, their desire to be within that home. Um, at times, not to blame parents for their actions, but it also can lead to abuse. And this is where we see children being punished for who they are and how they express themselves. But understand, I also understand the perspective that um, some parents and caregivers may feel that, you know, these young people are making decisions that are not well informed, where in fact, I'm sure a lot of young people have thought about some of the decisions that they're making in their lives in terms of how they express their gender or the names they choose to use and for whatever reason, or the pronouns that they feel to use and how affirming those things can be for them. Um, Due to some of the conversations that they're having in absence of their parents and more so with organizations like the BQIC and other school-based programs.
Right. And the danger being that there isn't any safe place, potentially, not the home, not the school, not a community program where they can truly express their identity and their forming identities.
Yeah, I think one of the dangers is that I think a lot of what I've seen happen is kind of this identity crisis that happens where folks are one way at home, one way at school, one way in their social circles, whether that be after school program or um, community based program. But having to I guess, form these different parts of themselves and not present their whole self has created some distortions in terms of how they connect with other folks in community.
Mm, almost having to take on different roles as opposed to just the authentic reality of who they are. Very challenging.
Yes, precisely.
We've been talking about the different types of violence in terms of structural violence, discrimination, suppression of their identity in certain settings. And I'm just wondering, how does this fit in with the youth who's also experiencing intimate partner violence in the home? I'm wondering about the situation where the young person is living in a home context with adults, and there's intimate partner violence happening between the parents or the parental figures, and how that might play out or impact um, a youth who's non-binary, for instance.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's interesting. Kind of like how are folks responding to witnessing violence at home?
That's
Um,
right.
I think that I think we're seeing this manifest in a variety of ways. For queer children and youth, some of them adopt these toxic behaviors. So if there was an abusive male figure in the home, they themselves may kind of adopt a mentality uh, that can be viewed as very toxic or abusive, and therefore they perpetuate that same type of um, violence with their partners because that's kind of what they know. Um, and similarly, there may be individuals in the home who would have witnessed their parent, in most cases, a female parent, be abused, and it can make them become defensive, or it can always put them on guard. So they're not able to let their guard down to be open to relationships. They're kind of always on defense because there's this need to defend themselves. They're always in this fight mode, which have, of course, affected a lot of people. And we know that when parents are experiencing violence, sometimes their children are subject to that same violence. Um, and it
Absolutely.
affects them.
Right, right. So there's the exposure to experiencing the violence that one parental figure is doing to another parental figure. But then there's also the potential, which we know happens all too often, where the abusive adult is also abusive towards the youth or the child.
Yes, exactly. And it kind of creates this normalization of the abuse, where for some, they may, as I mentioned, they may become defensive all the time because that's what they're used to, that's what they're exposed to, that's kind of their reality for the most part. Um, and then for others, they kind of respond to that negatively, and sometimes we see um, some of the outbursts that folks are having because they feel helpless, they feel hopeless, they feel no one understands them. And a lot of that stems from just witnessing the violence and also being silent. If we're talking, like I said earlier, about how children's voices and their agencies are being policed in
Right.
school and in other social settings.
And I would imagine that there would be youth whose identity might be used by someone who is engaging in abusive behavior, like an adult in the home, to target that youth in a way to try to disempower and control in a coercive way that young person.
Yeah, we know that the bullying. I don't even know if it's fair to call it bullying, but the responses or the things that some parents and caregivers may tell a young person, especially when they're queer or trans. And for a lot of these individuals, like I said, if we're thinking our youngest youth, they're not involved in intimate relationships, but they may have expressions that go against some of the societal norms. So it can be um, an effeminate young man that's suspected to be gay, but they've not formed um, any relationships or even identify as a gay person. And like I said, because the language is changing, even gay men, young men, are rejecting this notion because uh, I would say that history. So there are some folks who embrace certain terms in the queer and trans communities, and others who reject it because it's kind of connected to some of the violence they may have experienced in the home by their adult caretakers or in the schools among their peers. But regardless of that, we're still seeing that a lot of the response itself is it's created a lot of confusion for young people where, like I said, they aren't able to form meaningful relationships. So that's how that witnessing that violence affects them very personally. Or in fact, they kind of perpetuate the violence because they consider it a norm. And it also creates other issues where if a person is not used to being abused and you try to um, bring that mentality into the relationship, it's going to create tension and it further creates isolation and a disconnection for these young people forming healthy relationships with each other.
Right. Tatiana, from your perspective, what do service providers need to know when supporting um, gender and sexually diverse children and youth? What are the things that you would want them to understand and know to best serve those youths?
Yeah, I think a lot of service providers, thankfully, especially those who are in a city as diverse as Toronto, have access to a variety of trainings, gender inclusion trainings, trauma-based trainings, trainings to equip them with the skills and the tools to properly identify and respond to LGBTQ identities. Um, on one hand, participating in the training is good, but sometimes there are things that kind of fall through the cracks. This is observed in what we see happening in child welfare, where um, children may be removed from their home because of abuse, but knowledge of that abuse related to their gender identity or sexual orientation is not documented. So I think it depends on where service providers are positioned. If they're positioned um, in a child protection agency, it's really being able to sit down and create a comfortable environment for the young people to share, to really open up, to reveal those uncomfortable truths. Um, and at times, like I said, sometimes when you're bullied, the reason that you have been bullied is what you want to dismiss. So if it's because of your identity, then that's not something that you're going to embrace. It's not something that you're going to be very proud of because that's kind of being the essence of where your pain comes from. And service providers should be mindful of that um, just having an LGBTQ program or a queer person is not enough to really supporting queer and trans children. We need to create environments where they feel safe, and with time, they're able to open up. They're able to express some of the hardships that they've experienced, but they're also able to express what they would like moving forward for their life. The Black Race Collective, we actually hosted a web series during the pandemic, and one of our discussion topics were on healthy relationships. And we kind of created a toolkit to help folks assess, you know, different aspects of their identity, but also how those key components, having a safe environment, having good social connections, having financial resources, all interplay to create environments that allows queer and trans folks to flourish. So I think service providers should continue to do the assessments, but really take a critical look at what's happening and really understand why or how children and youth are going to respond to some of the questions around their identity. Think about the abuse not just from the perspective of this has happened, but also how have these children and youth coped. And then also, of course, me being more outcomes driven, thinking about like what are the plans for the future? How can we equip these young people with the tools, resources, or even communities to support their restoration in times when they may have felt broken? And that can be, of course, having a list of agencies readily available for the young people to make those appropriate referrals. It can be creating environments like social spaces for young people to interact if they're at that place. And sometimes it's just having a quiet place for those young people to talk. For them, sometimes I would say what has worked is a lot of people kind of when they're going through an adverse experience, they themselves may not want to share their experience, but they would want to see that experience be discussed and addressed. And that's where service providers can kind of help to facilitate some of those engagements, whether it's a panel, a community outing, or even an event that focus on a topic that affects the children and youth. In this case, intimate partner violence and coping, or um, a fresh start, starting a new life after a particular experience.
And so I'm sure we can provide our audience later with the link to that toolkit, which sounds like it would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. One of the things that you've talked about agency, and we know the importance of resistance and resilience in young people. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on how do we really foster the existing strengths and continue to build capacity for youth from gender and sexually diverse communities?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges have been, well, what I often hear in my work is we don't know how many folks are affected. And I think one is too many. Um, as mentioned with the example with child welfare, the Toronto's Children Aid Society had commissioned discussion during Pride for their network of providers. And one of my questions to them was how many LGBTQ youth are in care? And that was a question that they're unable to answer because, like I said, that data is not, it's documented, but it's not coded in a way that's explicit. There have been a lot of folks in the Black community who have been kind of advocating for more disaggregated data. You know, we want more information on these specific communities so we can create appropriate responses
Mhm.
based on those communities. And I think that's where there's still this ongoing challenge. I think there needs to be a greater investment in research. But also, I think it's about engaging those communities who know their communities best to create interventions that are appropriate. Because what works for one group may not necessarily work for the other.
Right. And those people at that grassroots community level are probably in the best position to recognize strengths and resistance and to support strengths and resistance.
Yeah, and I think I also I always frame it as I don't think that it's just I think it's a communal issue. So we engage a variety of stakeholders in our work, and that's been very beneficial in terms of having a measurable impact. So I think for service providers, for agencies that's wanting to do this work, it's about engaging all of those stakeholders as well. Um, I think that, of course, consulting with parents, we need to understand what are the stressors in parents' lives that's causing them to, I guess, be hostile towards their children and youth. Um, I know that in queer and trans communities, there are a lot of LGBTQ folks who are still connected to religious communities, despite some notions that would suggest that um, uh, queer and trans individuals are just foregoing religion and foregoing their spiritual beliefs or paths. We understand that every situation is different, and that's why those assessments need to really identify and respond to those individual needs, opposed to the more general, broad approach that's being used. Um, in terms of, I guess, specific tools, I would say that the investment in research is needed because we also need to know what has worked. We've tried a lot of interventions. As mentioned, the BQIC was formed in 2017, and we've supported hundreds of Black queer and trans youth. And we do have some data, but our data is also very limited based on the demographic that we serve. Um, in our community needs assessment, we spoke to, I guess we not really spoke to, but we reported on um, some of the findings around what Black and trans youth in Ontario are experiencing, who they are, what are some of, I guess, some of the priorities for the future of our work. But I think all agencies need to do that. Or in fact, like I said, when we take this, multi-sectoral approach, we would need to have it commissioned so that there's a national research project that engages communities to really have the data in terms of really creating informed responses to the community's needs.
And to support them, like to help them ensure that they can do that um, data collection. It, it can feel, I'm sure, at the agency level, if there's not the supports that go with that and training if necessary, it can feel like just another load to the already heavy workload in terms that falls on agencies.
Yeah, I can understand that as well. And I think that um, one of the joys and fears is there's joy in obviously creating a good intervention, but there's a fear of taking on all of that work and feeling very overwhelmed by it. And I think that's where delegation is needed. I think if for agencies that's doing more protection work, that's going to look very different from individuals who are kind of more interested in evidence-based approaches. And that's also going to look more different from the schools that's providing just a learning environment for these children and youth. But everyone has kind of a role to play in supporting this young person outside of their parent and caretakers. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think the agency's ability to understand what's within their capacity and engage folks who are able to address issues that's outside of their capacity or kind of a, like correlated to the work that they're doing with the children and youth would be beneficial.
Exactly. And again, it sounds like what you're saying is we may divide our services and, of course, the things we focus on within services, but young people's live whole lives. Their lives aren't divided into those segments in the way that often our services are. So again, that collaboration and coordination between services becomes really important.
Precisely.
Yeah. Anything that you haven't already mentioned, Tatiana, that you would really like to share with the audience, and in particular in terms of where you hope things move to in the future in supporting children and youth?
Yeah, I would say in closing, I think that we are entering this very technological age. And I was on a panel speaking about, unrelated to this topic, but we were talking about the influencer culture um, and whether influencers are essentially a job and how lucrative it is. And one of my recommendations was to embrace the fact that the way we live and work is changing. And whilst influencer is a modern term, it is just a form of digital marketing. So for me, something that I want to share is I think in responding to or even kind of identifying children and youth needs, we have to also embrace technology because, as I mentioned, a lot of young people are connecting online. That's those apps, whether it's a dating app or a social app, have become a key part of how they operate in their daily lives. Um, and as service providers, we need to be able to make that transition that's comfortable for folks because we also know that there's a need for privacy and autonomy. There's a need for folks to separate their personal lives from other aspects of their life. But there's also a beautiful silver lining where we can kind of be able to create places for young people to engage in discussions or create games and story times and songs that beautifully capture what young people's current needs are, but also what they'd like to see. Um, and yeah, I think for me, I love music, I love cooking, I love food, and I think it'll be nice to be able to have more places for us to talk and connect about specific issues beyond our limited social circles.
You make such an important point, Tatiana. It strikes me because it's that balance. We're always very aware or trying to keep up with some of the harms that technology can bring, or enable people to exploit others or harm others. But we also need to figure out ways to just embrace, as you say, and to see the potential in terms of creating community that might otherwise not exist if it weren't for those virtual spaces, and that the goal is not to rule them out or prevent children and youth from accessing them, because they will. It's how to ensure their space and that they really are supportive, nurturing spots for young people.
Exactly. I always say, gone are the days, even when we think about like climate change and some of the more eco-friendly approaches we're taking. Like a lot of print resources are not having the same reach as, say, something like a podcast or something like a lot of the folks. I'm not on it, but a lot of folks are on TikTok. A
Yes.
TikTok video can generate millions of views, which means that's an audience of millions of people. So how we adapt our services to reach such a wide audience, um, while sticking to a specific message is going to be one of those additional challenges that service providers are going to have to respond to. But I think it's a beautiful challenge in that when you embrace innovation, um, you're able to create something that's, yeah, just beautiful by happenstance.
Mm. Tatiana, thank you so much for sharing this space with us today. And congratulations on the 5th anniversary of the Black Queer Youth Collective. We will include a link to the collective, and I'm sure that's where people will be able to find access to the tool that you mentioned to support youth. And we just want to thank you for your amazing work and to encourage you in your future work.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And for our listeners, please stay tuned for our next episode. And you can do that by looking out for an email from the Learning Network to see when that episode is ready. Take care and goodbye. And thanks again, Tatiana.